You're listening to a special podcast edition of The Final Straw. This is a continuation of our conversation with Shon Meckfessel about his book, Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be, out from AK Press. We range in conversation across topics such as nihilism, insurrectional approaches, social and antisocial anarchism, the Blues Brothers, ressentiment, and more. If you enjoy this conversation or have thoughts you want to share, drop us a line at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or rate us on your podcasting apparatus, whatever an apparatus is. Or you can write us at The Final Straw, care of AshevilleFM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. So you mentioned anti-fascist violence also, and so they're like shifting a little bit maybe from property destruction in terms of reflecting back to because it can feel like a liberatory act taking space and damaging institutions that damage us, even if only a window or something else that is easily replaced and probably covered by insurance. But there's the disruption of the flow of capitalism that is engaged with through rioting, whether property destruction is a part of it or blocking a highway during the First Persian Gulf War, or after.
And if I can break it, there's those examples, and I think, you brought up, people really misunderstand when they think it's just about the material effect. And I think sometimes we act like that's the thing. We're like, deeds, not words. It's not, who cares what you think or something. It's the reality. But that's, as a rhetorician, that's the worst way to think of it. What's important isn't the material consequences of it, because as somebody I talked to in the book brought up, we're never going to really affect Wells Fargo's bottom line enough to make him reconsider. The important thing is the willingness to take those on, to attack, because property relations are kind of the most sacred thing. Corporate property is the most sacred thing in our society. It's kind of like, the church was in the Middle Ages or something. So for us to do that sort of sacrilege or profanation of choosing publicly to attack protected property, it's meant to call those values into question. It's some people talk about a value struggle. So that's I think where the value lies. Not that we're actually going to be like shutting down Wells Fargo by breaking one of their windows.
But there has to be taken into account that there is an impact, maybe not by breaking a specific window or shutting down a specific Wells Fargo, but by swarming streets, blocking traffic, costing the city money in terms of policing, or blocking a highway after a black life is taken from their community and the police aren't indicted for it. That does have a material impact, not just stopping things and making everyone in their cars think about what's going on, but also a material consequences on the economic system and its functioning that forces people in positions of power to have to react, right?
Yeah, you said it. I mean, I think sometimes I think of those as making consequences. People talk about those as making consequences. So that's certainly an important part. That's that kind of disruptive mechanism. It doesn't matter if authorities listen to what you say. You make it matter that if they want to keep things going, they're going to have to acknowledge you and deal with you, right? So totally, I think that material side is important. I just think that we've tended to overestimate. We've tended to act like that's the only thing going on, and I think it's more complex.
So we've talked about two different kinds of, really briefly, two different ways of looking at anti-capitalist violence. Recently, there's been a few notable moments, and this is maybe part of a wider three-way fight, but where non-state, non-corporate agents that popular movements feel in opposition to, in the form of racist, reactionary, Islamophobic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, group street formations, like Nazis and Klan and stuff like that, have been met with force when they've attempted to take public space in the United States. And a few examples are Anaheim and Santa Cruz last year, Columbia, South Carolina, might have been 2 years ago now.
Sacramento, my hometown.
Yeah, Sacramento.
Had a really big fight. Yeah.
The punching of Richard Spencer, which is more funny and entertaining than anything else from as opposed to actually having an immediate reaction. But this is another form of, ostensibly, it's the same people that are anti-capitalist participating in this engagement. What does that what is that physical confrontation? How does that fit into what you're talking about in terms of riots, or is that a different discourse?
It's related, and I think people in both circumstances, they often dress black bloc, which is a tactic that came from anti-fascist resistance in Germany in the 80s and 90s as a means of protecting immigrants by smashing up the social centers that fascists were using as bases of operation when they're attacking immigrants. But I think actually a lot of the time it is somewhat different people. And I think it's a different dynamic. So I think one of the problems that we have and how we think about this stuff, like we kind of Americans and especially we radicals, is that we think in terms of identities. We kind of fixate on these certain moments that we think are sexier than other moments, and then we base ourselves on that instead of looking at the world and the subtle differences that we're presented with at different times. So I think we do well to do more of the second and less of the first. So I think anti-fascist violence works by a really different dynamic than anti-capitalist violence. As I was saying, I kind of think anti-capitalist violence is about this public performance where you're disrespecting sacred property relations and respecting lives. Even police are generally not seriously injured in a lot of these riots. And when police, for example, were shot in Dallas, people were very quick to disown that. They said, that wasn't the movement. We wouldn't do that. Not that there's sympathy with police or policing, but that's not what it's about. Anti-fascist violence works by a different dynamic. I talk about this in the book in terms of there's this great story about the pieing of Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant was, sorry.
I love this part.
So a lot of people don't, thanks. It's interesting. It's interesting when I wrote the book, a lot of people didn't really see this as fitting in, but I'm really glad I left it in because it's more relevant than ever right now. A lot of people don't realize right after the Stonewall riots and the Compton cafeteria riots, suddenly there were a bunch of states that passed laws permitting gay and lesbian marriage during the gay liberation movement. A lot of places around the U.S. were like, well, if they love each other, then why not? Then in the early 70s, this woman, Anita Bryant, she was a country music singer and a beauty queen, and she did orange juice commercials. She went on this tour and became a figurehead of anti-queer legislation that was trying to shut down these new laws. And she had smashing success. She basically, all the places that had laws permitting gay and lesbian marriage were overturned, and she really got started this sort of modern queer movement that we're seeing in full force now. So she was on a roll, and she was doing pretty well. Her organization was doing pretty well. She was having a lot of successes. People didn't really know how to respond. And when she did this television spot in, I think, Minneapolis, and she was going on about, and the gays, when they're coming into our living rooms and they're turning over our American way of life, whatever. As she was in the middle of the sentence, these two gay men just slapped her in the face with a big cream pie. And you got to look this up on YouTube. It's a really incredible moment. She's interrupted in this spewing vitriol moment, and she looks totally silly with these chunks of cream pie dripping off her face. She tries to reclaim the moment by saying, well, at least it was a fruit pie, but it just totally fails. It doesn't, it's not a fruit pie, it's a cream pie. And it just, she's made a fool of. And from that moment, her whole campaign fell apart. She didn't work anymore as a figurehead. She kind of became this laughingstock. She retired from public life. I think she's still alive. She's around, but she just didn't work anymore as a public symbol of anti-queer, anti-queer hatred. So I apply this. I think that's the moment of anti-fascist violence. It's not necessarily about injuring somebody, though obviously sometimes it happens. What it's about is that, fascism is kind of a one-trick pony. It's a very complicated phenomenon, but the one thing it does is it exerts this kind of impenetrable iron security. The image of fascism is the bundle of sticks, and no one stick can be broken when you're all tied together. And so when somebody's trying to embody that and they're made a fool of, the whole thing, it kind of falls apart. It doesn't work anymore. If you can show vulnerabilities in people trying to do that, they don't work as leaders anymore. Another very powerful example of this that's a bit less comic is William Pierce, who's one of the most dangerous American fascists of the last half century. He's the guy that wrote the Turner Diaries, which is kind of the Bible of the neo-Nazi movement. William Pierce was having a great deal of success organizing on college campuses in the early 70s. He was touring around. He had an organization that was getting, really swift increases in membership. He's having these really big successes. And then he was speaking on the campus of, I think, George Washington University in D.C., and he got egged. In the middle of his address, a bunch of activists threw eggs at him. And again, it didn't injure him in a way that might bring out people's sympathies. It was just kind of ridiculous. But from that moment on, when he tried to do a public event, people would be like, "Oh, you're that like egg Nazi guy." And everybody had this image of like, yolks dripping off his like face as he's trying to see Kyle. And it's silly. And it made his public career fall apart, and he wasn't able to do it anymore. That's why he went into basically hiding, or he retired from public life. And he still, he wrote the Turner Diaries, which is a very dangerous work of literature. But imagine if he'd been able to continue public mobilization, we'd be in a much worse space. So I think anti-fascist violence turns on that kind of moment of embarrassment. If being a fascist means anything, it's like, you're not going to embarrass me. And if you can embarrass somebody and show that it's not what it's claiming to be, it just doesn't work to protect you, then it just kind of falls apart. And I think that's the way to understand certainly that video where Richard Spencer's getting punched. I think it was beautiful. Like when the stuff was touching off, with the election, I was like, what's our pie moment or our egg moment going to be now? And it's totally that, like, it's like the 20 remixes I've seen to like, Whitney Houston and New Order of Richard Spencer getting punched. And then, and then sort of crying about it afterwards. It's not just that he gets punched. He like doesn't punch back. He looks like his feelings are hurt. And you're like, that guy's not like the iron will. That guy's like a douche.
It's kind of interesting because, like, for me, I think fascist ideology, it does have to emulate a strength together, but it also has to, at the same time, embrace a sort of weakness alone. Like, this is why we have to come together, is because we are bullied because these people are taking our jobs and our dignity and forcing us onto the fringes and obscurity of life. But we have like a beautiful collective future that if we just engage together as a one and repress these capital O others, that we, become this beautiful future forever and ever. And so it has to engage both a weakness and a victimhood while at the same time a strength. So I don't know if would it be different on a symbolic level if it was just an individual white guy getting bullied, like one of those comic book ads from the 1950s of the kids sitting on the beach getting like sand kicked in their face or whatever.
Beautiful. Yeah, totally.
But join your local phalange and they'll teach you how to be a mange or whatever.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think there's a before and after. I mean, as a teacher, I teach at a community college that's 80% students of color. That also means it's 20% white students. And those 20% students, those 20% white students, I'm really careful these days. I would hope that I've always been careful, but I'm especially careful these days to never shame them, right? And I have Trump supporters and everything. They're where they're at. That's what we got. Like, they're in my classroom. We're sharing space. And so, like, in a situation like that, I don't want to be kicking sand in their face, right? I want to be hearing them out. I want to make them feel like it's not like us who are humiliating them. I don't want to put them on the defensive. So I think, that when we talk about dialogue and stuff, on that end, it's totally true. But I think they're in that sort of before stage, and somebody like Richard Spencer or the neo-Nazi who got clocked and knocked out at the Berkeley protests, or, whatever, William Pierce on stage, they're in the after phase, and they're trying to communicate that, like, once you join up and embrace this, that makes you safe. And if then you show, well, actually, you're pretty ridiculous looking, then it doesn't work anymore. So I think it's a really good point. I really like that book that a lot of people have been reading. Some people think it sort of went too soft on on the right-wing swing we're seeing, but I think it's actually really, really helpful. It's called Strangers in there. Give me a second. Actually, I want to look it up.
Oh, sure.
I don't want to get this wrong.
While
you
you're
know
looking,
what I'm talking about?
no, I don't. While you're looking that up, though, I was when you were talking about, I didn't know about William Pierce getting egged and whatever, and I'm curious, just a total tangent that I'm going to cut out of this, but that made me think of. I've always kind of wondered about in Blues Brothers, which is an anti-racist film and was an anti-racist project in a lot of ways. And it's funny that people are still reflecting like Antifa folks that are like were ARA before in the US and have been organized, and they're like, we're going to get the band back together. Obvious reference to Blues Brothers.
I've heard that, but yeah, totally.
I've heard it in over a few different like podcasts and different sources where the people use that phrase, which is awesome. Yeah. But the whole like Illinois Nazis, I hate Illinois Nazis. I always kind of wondered where that was coming from, and if that was depending on the time frame, a sort of re-emulation of what happened to William Pierce. Do you know, his Wikipedia page doesn't say anything about the egging, but do you know when that happened?
Do you, yeah, I think the egging was like 72, 73.
Okay.
Are we recording this? Because I think this is an interesting thing to include.
Okay, yeah, I could. Yeah, I am. I haven't stopped it or anything.
Yeah, cool. No, I think it's really important to remember that. And I think, I'm going to be honest. I've been trying to pick out the nuances of like the, political strains in the U.S. for my whole life, really. And I've been caught really unprepared, especially, I don't think, as a good old punk rocker, I don't think I ever really distinguished enough between actual conservatives and fascists. I think if you asked me a year ago, I would say, they're all sort of implicitly fascist. But we're seeing divisions that show that that's just not the case. And of course, conservatives are still defending a centuries-old legacy of white supremacy. That's not up for question, but that's structural white supremacy, and the ideology that justifies it or that legitimizes it is a pretty different thing than like open white nationalism. And I don't think I really took that seriously enough before. But I've been, since the election, and particularly since I was next to this shooting by alt-right shooter of an anarchist protester a couple months ago, I've been delving into the literature. There's some really great stuff. Blood and Politics is a classic, and a lot of other books. There's always been this pretty significant underbelly of white nationalist organizing in the U.S. since it stopped being the official ideology at the end of the Civil War. Or, at the end of the Civil War, it became displaced into Jim Crow laws, essentially sort of American apartheid. And then when the Civil Rights Movement delegitimized those, it's been displaced into sort of talk of criminality and mass incarceration. But it's never gone away. And I think that's, those institutions are one side of it. And another side of it is that there's always been meetings of these people. They've always been around. And I don't think any of us took them seriously enough. I think a lot of us were kind of snickering at them as like backwoods, ignorant, blah, blah, blah. And it's a very dangerous misreading. They're not ignorant. It's a very well-organized social movement with a lot of resources, people, all sorts of different levels. And when we respond, we have to respond to them it's like with respect, with loathing, and recognizing them as our enemy. But you kind of got to respect that people know what they're doing, and they have like a real focused idea. And as part of that, we look at the differences among them. We try to find the contradictions within their movement to play up. But I think this is, one of my friends said, this is what we get for saying don't read the comments, and it's really true. Like, they've been there all along, and we just didn't want to see them. So I think we better start looking at them now, because they're looking at us.
Over the last few years, I've seen a lot more foregrounding of debates and discussions about like talking about what sort of internal organizing and what philosophical underpinnings are being engaged with by far-right organizing that are written from an antifa or anti-racist perspective with an eye towards that sort of thing. And I think that Three-Way Fight blog and It's Going Down are two sources. I'm really looking forward to reading the Alexander Reed Ross book that just came out recently, Against the Fascist Creep, because I know that individual has done a lot of research into like the social engagement of third positionism, which in a lot of ways reflects a lot of the things that punks have been doing, which is why it became necessary to have songs like Nazi Punk Off, or the fact that the person who shot up the Sikh temple in outside of Milwaukee was in a punk scene. And I've got friends from Milwaukee who are like, we never knew that person. There are parallel music scenes. There are parallel underground culture, like resistance scenes to the ones that we engage with. And so understanding that and not underestimating where these people are coming from, or what that, just saying that they're dumb goons or boneheads or whatever, means that we can't fight them as effectively, or their ideology.
Yeah, and I think, this is terrifying to me. I wrote my first book about living in the Balkans, particularly former Yugoslavia, and Croatia primarily was really overrun with fascists the first time that I was hanging out there in '99, both in the state and on the streets. And those two things were sort of not the same. They had tensions, but they both made life very dangerous. My friends in Zagreb would have the calendar of all the football games, the soccer games, on their wall. And any day that there was going to be a major soccer game, they would know they'd have to buy their groceries before, because if they went out on the streets at all that day, they were going to get their face kicked in.
And that's because, for people in the U.S. context, because hooliganism often ties in right-wing political ideologies of either like nationalism or religious or ethnic extremism attached to it, right?
Yeah, sorry. There was particularly in former Yugoslavia, it just had a large series of wars, and so you had a lot of traumatized, messed up kids coming back from fighting, and then they'd have these national justifications for the trauma that they've gone through, and then that kind of hooks up to, in Europe, a lot of the sports teams are national sports teams because the countries are smaller, unlike the NFL or something. So it ends up overlapping on nationalist rhetoric. And yeah, you have like explosions of violence a lot of the time between football, soccer supporters of different countries. So but I try to keep it in mind all the time that the terrifying thing about white nationalism in its various forms is that it can work, right? It can be a sustainable political project. It can be a way to sort of daily reproduce wealth and accumulate it and do those things that societies do. It just does it in the most horrifying fashion that I can imagine, right? But it's not, the scariest thing about it is that it's not unrealistic. It's just evil. And I think so long as we've been kind of sneering it off, we haven't been taking that seriously enough. But they can do this. We just can't let them.
It's horrible for the externalization of violence, but also, and this is like a leverage point that I think people with, like, for those of us who are anti-authoritarians, the internalization of those violent structures within like white supremacy or any sort of like hard border ideological perspective of like, these are our people, we live in this way, we keep out the others and defend ourselves against the others. Like, when you build that boundary and that wall, like Trump's wall or whatever, all the people that are considered within that community are also being policed with high, like, patriarchy affects men as well as people who are defined as not men, but just in different ways. So it's not going to be good for any sort of community for some sort of like white utopia to come up, whether they be considered on the outside of that community or individuals within the inside of those communities. And that's maybe a leverage point, hopefully.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, actually, when I'm talking to white students, for example, about Black Lives Matter, I also point out that police kill white people in the U.S. at a higher rate than in any other developed country, than they kill like the average population or something. And that's because of anti-Black racism, right? So anti-Black racism even rebounds against working class and middle class whites in the end, in causing this more violent social arrangement. So I think I really like this. We particularly on the West Coast have a problem with this in the metropoles, but I think it's really important that we're humble in this moment as well as being badass. We need to be both badass and humble at the same time, and we really need to get what concerns people are coming with that have brought them to be attracted to a lot of the right wing stuff. And we really do need to present a better, more appealing way of doing things. I think in a lot of ways I've been preoccupied with for years that the left, and including post left or whatever, has just got so obsessed with shaming people, and like it's like our whole toolkit is just like how to make our friends feel really bad. And the right is all about how to make people feel proud. So it's like, aside from the actual beliefs, which of course I think are important, would people rather be around a bunch of people who are going to make them feel bad or good? It's like, I think the book that I tried to mention earlier, there's this wonderful work by Arlie Russell Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land. And I think she's a Berkeley sociologist, and I think she does a really fine balance of I think she's quite careful to never shift on her beliefs. She's quite clear about why she thinks that all these right-wing beliefs are totally wrong. But she spent 5 years doing a really in-depth ethnography, living with people in rural Louisiana, trying to kind of, one of the most right-wing voting areas in the country, trying to get where people are coming from, and listening to them as human beings. I think we need to balance these things. It's the kicking, the before and after thing you were talking about with that sort of the 50s comic book ads about how you got to bulk up. I think we need to take the before really seriously, as well as after. Don't understand. I'm not talking about dialoguing with white supremacist, white nationalist organizers. I think we need to demobilize them forcefully. We need to put them in that. We need to do whatever equivalent of pieing them we have to do in this moment. But we also have to kind of get why people are attracted to it. I think those are two of the three. In a three-way fight, I think two of those three force of those things.
Yeah. We have strayed slightly afar from the original topic of the book. Totally. It's been interesting, but I'm gonna switch back to it if you don't mind. In the subtitle to the book, you use the phrase "unarmed insurrection." What do you think? What does that term mean to you? And do you think that there is space for armed insurrection and radical counter-hegemonic struggle in the U.S.?
So the interesting thing, I didn't make that term up. I actually got it from Kurt Schock and Stephen Zunis and some other people who I think would be identified within the kind of nonviolence school of talking about social change. But they're within the side of it called strategic nonviolence that often I think us radicals have a lot to learn from, because they have a really good idea about processes of social change. And I think a lot of the time us radicals have trouble explaining how it is that we want to change things. But I think that's an important question to answer. So some of the big names in that I mentioned Stephen Zunis and Kurt Schock, and of course Eugene Sharp is maybe the most well-known. They have really good explanations of the kind of way that social change can happen and how social movements can help that. And they realized also in their time that nonviolence was a slippery term that was kind of had a very mixed history, and that people could use that to justify avoiding conflicts at times. They didn't want that meaning. So they sometimes realized that the biggest concern they had was about armed guns. The biggest concern they had was about using guns to try to bring about social change. And as I mentioned earlier, guns come with a lot of problems. They really centralize power. I heard this consistently from people that I was interviewing, people who, I presume were around a lot of riots and recent social movements, who embrace conflicts with physical confrontation with police and property destruction, but they make clear that for them it's a totally different thing than trying to push for social change with guns, because it's patently insane in our day to think that we can challenge the state in terms of, in an armed conflict. Not only the insane disproportion of the kinds of arms that we have, but especially with the surveillance state. There's just, even thinking about the crazy stuff that the guerrilla groups were doing in the early 70s in the U.S. is unthinkable in this present moment. This is all over the place, but I'm going to throw this in too, and even in that history of guerrilla struggle in the early 1970s, people I know from that struggle in Seattle were lucky enough to be around some of the veterans of the George Jackson Brigade and in the Bay Area as well. From talking to them, a lot of what they say is if they hadn't been underground and just getting their news from kind of like movement newspapers and staying in safe houses with like some of the other most like radical folks, they would have got that stuff wasn't really having the effects that they hoped it would. And they were some of the stuff that they did was cool. Some of it was kind of crazy, but it just like the whole thought that they were about to touch off the revolution only made sense to them because they were so insular. So I just think that we're not in a moment where guns are going to be the most useful tool for bringing about social change because they come with too many drawbacks. And not just me, I think most people I talk to. Now, unfortunately, in terms of defense, it's maybe more complicated. And I think like we made the distinction in the past between armed struggle, where you try to overthrow the current social order with guns, and armed self-defense, where, if the Klan shows up to your house or neo-Nazis or whatever, you might want a way to respond. That's a more complicated question. But particularly I think I said this stuff before with like Syria and concentrating arms and everything. Those I think are really important examples of even the Zapatista movement has had to deal with some contradictions and trying to be led by communities, but having to be somewhat clandestine with its military organization. I think one of the ways to understand the longer history of the Zapatistas is trying to cope with that difficulty. But it's a real difficulty, and I think it's not one we should rush into. And I've seen situations such as there are situations such as in Syria where I don't have a better suggestion. I mean, when I don't really know what else I would do, but it's just I would say you look at the precedent. Once the guns come out, you're probably not going to have a decentralized, diffused, direct, democratic, or whatever you want to call it, society, because power is going to start accumulating quickly in the hands of whoever's giving the orders and whoever has like the more serious military position.
So just being informed by what I read through Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War.
Oh, you read that? That's so awesome.
Yeah, it's a really good book.
You read that.
So just shout out, Submedia did an interview with Robin Yassin Kassab a while ago. The other co-author is Layla Al-Shami. It's available through, I think, University of Chicago in the U.S., maybe. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it talks about the development talks about the Assad regimes, and it talks about popular movements and popular councils underneath those and how they changed throughout time. And the point at which armed struggle started seeming to, and this is just within like the certain communities that they're talking about, and it's kind of hard to draw the line when it's Al-Qaeda or Daesh or whatever influenced insurrection against the Assad regime, or Hezbollah or like other powers, regional powers coming in and inserting themselves. But the armed resistance that occurred was within the context of, all right, well, they keep just like dropping barrel bombs on us or using their secret police to like disappear people and bring back their bludgeoned bodies, or torture people, or like fill the prisons. So, which is, I mean, the prisons are full here, but under a different context slightly.
Yeah, there's an Amnesty report that just came out of 14,000 people getting hung in one prison. So it's pretty bad.
Yeah, that's insane. And this is just a recent development, like after all these international powers have gotten involved and the siege of Aleppo and war hitting that country for so long, over half a decade. That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, we should do like a whole nother show about Syria, because I used to live in Syria, and I'm actually currently writing a documentary about it, and from an anarchist perspective.
I would love that.
I think I would love to talk about Syria, as a future show. I think we've actually ended up with the current fascist dilemma we're living under because we didn't care about it happening in Syria, and a lot of the left even supported it, because for some reason they thought Assad was on the other side of things than the U.S., and a lot of the left, not so many anarchists, but some, their only priority in this stuff is as a way to be oppositional within their own country. And sometimes that's not the only thing going on, and you need to have a more nuanced critique. But I think
you mean the tanky approach?
In that, yeah, but it's not just tankies anymore. I mean, it's really, Chomsky just signed, Chomsky, Glenn Greenwald, a bunch of other people that, in the past have been fine, have been good, just signed on to a letter in defense of Rania Khalek, that's unconscionable, and essentially it's a very pro-Assad line. And it's just, Oh, yeah, that's a whole nother thing. But I think if for anybody who's left, stunned at this current moment we're in and wondering where it came from, I mean, first of all, yes, it's coming from a continuum of centuries. In another way, we've neglected to take seriously enough the organized white nationalist undercurrent that's been working at stuff for a long time. But really, I think Syria has been a big part of it. We've let Russia do what it wants in Syria. We just decided that it was fake news when we heard about 500,000 people being murdered, where we saw photos every day. And now it's come, parts of that have made it to where we are. And I think it's time we take it a little more seriously, because we can't. Yeah, it's come home.
I would love to continue having this conversation, but I want to bring up stuff that would just that would end up taking us on even longer trajectories to the side. But let's schedule something.
Yeah, let's do another. Yeah.
Okay. Because I wanted to talk about the YPG and the PYD, and that's a complex, as they bring up in the book, that's a pretty complex thing. And we've done some shows with Americans who have gone over, and I talked to Dilar Derek a few years ago about the PYD project. But yeah.
I'm worried. I actually went through Rojava before the conflict started in 2009. I took a road trip through that area, and I've been very sympathetic with Kurdish liberatory struggle for decades. I've been following it, but it's complex, and Kurds aren't like a sort of different species of human being, and I'm definitely concerned, and to the point of horrified sometimes, that anarchists in the West have taken this up as a second civil war, and it's kind of this pure moment of social revolution that's not complicated with all the Arabs and Muslims and all this stuff that they have to actually figure out. And you can just have this moment of look, it's women with guns, and it's and I think it's really bad. I think we're ending up. I'm certainly sympathetic with the liberatory sort of social revolution elements that have happened in the Kurdish areas of Syria. But I think people are being terribly naive about the context that's happening in. It's not a coincidence that there hasn't been direct conflict with Assad. That's kind of part of it.
Yeah.
And the PYD, the state partition, overseeing this whole thing, they're not anti-authoritarians. They're quite a thuggish organization that I just saw yesterday. I saw stories that there was a widespread arrest of 30, 40 people in a town that are being forcibly conscripted. That's not something that we can support.
Yeah.
That's not like a utopian scenario, as much as there are things worth supporting within it, for sure.
Coca-Cola.
You talk about the implications within an individual and thus generalized in a wider movement or community or constituency of people of disidentification, disinvestment, and desubjectification in relation and understanding of power in the formation of oppositional thought and the opportunity for resistance. Whew. Can you talk about these 3 Ds in relation?
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job. I think, again, I don't expect anybody to understand what these mean off the cuff. It's that I was seeing these patterns when I was interviewing people and kind of trying to figure out what to call them. It's been a while too, but disidentification, I think, is sort of that you have this confusion where individuals, and their like bodies, their faces, their personalities get kind of wrapped up in the social office that they're serving, right? And so I think, for example, part of the way that liberals have been horrified by Trump is a horrifying phenomenon, don't get me wrong, but part of it is just that somebody in the position of president could have such a revolting personality as Trump. And I think, radicals who tend to look at things more structurally are sort of like, who cares about the personality if they're doing this horrible stuff? So disidentification is when people go from one to the other and they're able to kind of separate out the person from their chair, is kind of the way that I put it, from the position that they're from their job. And I talk about that in the context of physical clashes with police, because one of the moments, I was really interested in moments where people sort of felt transformed politically, especially radicalized. And one of the things that happened is when somebody looks at a police officer and they see the state, they see the totality of, state control and the immensity of, everything behind it. And then there's this moment, where maybe somebody pushes back against the cop and the cop doesn't respond. Or I remember in a very non-American context, I was at Turkey one time and a cop stopped this guy for not having a ticket for a train, and the guy punched the cop in the face and ran away. And the cop kind of like looked sad, like held his nose and didn't do anything. In a moment like that, suddenly it's like that officer is actually there's just a person there, right? And instead of being the whole representative of the state structure, they lose that power. There's a quote that I use in that section that from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who I like a lot, and he sort of says it's like church. Church has these liturgical conditions that kind of help you feel holy. They set up this reverence, and like you think of a big mass or something, where there's incense and there's candles and there's this phenomenal architecture and there's a guy speaking maybe Latin in the old days in front and these crazy clothes. All those details are necessary to make you think of that person as like an instance of the sacred. And to I almost swore, but it's radio, to mess with the conditions that set that up is one of the things that people do in rioting. So it's one thing to sort of see the state trump in their riot gear or whatever, but as soon as like something kind of ridiculous happens to them, as soon as they're shown to not be powerful, you're able to kind of put some distance between the social institution that they're serving and that person. So the pieing thing that I mentioned earlier, like the equation of Anita Bryant as a figurehead of anti-queerness, protecting family, heteronormative family values, that equation just kind of falls apart the moment she's just sort of this pathetic figure with pie dripping off her face. It doesn't have the liturgical conditions of invoking that institution anymore. So that's the disidentification. Disinvestment is it's more like, I took that from the understanding of how white racism works, where it's not so much that people are ignorant that, people of color are full human beings or whatever. It's not a lack of knowledge. It's that people are invested in and feel loyalty to white supremacy because they expect some kickbacks from it. And it's a rational strategy. It actually makes sense. It's just, evil. And so disinvestment is a way where you put distance within the the activist person, within the person who's in the movement, and they start to feel a little bit less connected to their own whiteness. They might be they might still be read as white within society and have the privileges of being white, but not feel loyal to whiteness in the same way, or all sorts of other types of privilege work in the same dynamic. So disinvestment, I think it's another thing that happens during riots where people feel less attached to their privilege, and you can even feel kind of revulsion to your own privilege and decide to fight the system that's giving you that unfair advantage over others. So that's the way that I think of disinvestment. And then finally, desubjectification is subject seems like can be a really confusing word, but in the kind of discourse world that I'm talking about, a subject is sort of a voice that gets to speak and be recognized. So, for example, if we're talking about Syria, I can't think of a single. Actually, I could ask you: you read *Burning Country* and all this kind of thing. Before you read that book, is there a single Syrian revolutionary that you could imagine? Is that a subject? Is it a subject position, is what you call it, where you're like, oh, Syrian revolutionaries, they say this.
Probably not.
Right. So, I think, for example, if you say fascist, if you say German fascist or American fascist, we can think of somebody and kind of imagine what they might say. If you say hippie, we can think of somebody and imagine they would say. If you say Syrian revolutionary, there's probably not somebody pops into your head and you can't imagine what they say. So a subject in this sense is like a place to speak from. It's like a recognizable social position where oh, that's a German fascist or whatever, right? So one of the other things that I think rioting does, and this I brought up with the kind of property destruction end, is it destabilizes who are subjects and who aren't. So the corporate voice, even if Nike is not a person, we can kind of, unfortunately, you and I can kind of imagine what Nike would say about something, right? We've been bombarded with ads and brand building and all this kind of thing, so that Nike is a subject. We can imagine the sort of Nike attitude about something, as gross as it is, and maybe for most people, a anarcho-feminist might not be something that they could necessarily imagine. So I think one thing that happens in riots is that people try to take away from the solidity, like when somebody smashes up Nike Town, as I've seen, I think at least 3 times here in Seattle. It's this thing that happens. It kind of destabilizes listening to Nike and thinking of Nike in the same way. It kind of takes their position as a subject away, if only for a moment. It kind of makes you have to do a double take because it's not supposed to be there. And if you hear that an anarcho-feminist block is the one that smashes up, then suddenly you're like, oh, I wonder what they say, and you can kind of imagine them. So that one's a little complicated, but it's one of the things that the sort of counter-hegemonic political violence can do is sort of take away make us stop listening to people that we're listening to too much and make us aware that there's a voice to listen to. I wrote a lot of this before Black Lives Matter. I kept writing it during Black Lives Matter, but so much of it was strikingly manifesting all the time. And I think the Black Lives Matter perspective was a really beautiful example of sort of desubjectification and kind of forming a new subject. I think even right-wing Americans, even Trump people or whatever, I think are aware that Black Lives Matter represents a sort of place to speak from and it has a perspective, even if they don't want to hear it. That wasn't true. The issue of endemic racist police violence didn't have a subject position 5 years ago in the way that it does now.
That's a really interesting way of putting it. Can you talk about the framings of popular and criminal violence versus legitimate resistance within the classical liberal understanding of the subjects and objects? And likewise, what's the spell that's broken by public acts of property transgression?
Well, I think for the most part, I define liberal as people who sort of think of our current institutions as adequate, right? So radicals are people who think that we have social problems that our current institutions can't solve. And liberals are people who feel devoted to those institutions and hope that they will be able to solve our problems. There's an interesting thing with that. You might edit this out. I don't know if it's going to be helpful to you. When we had the shooting on the UW campus, the police released the shooter, who is a follower of the alt-right, because he claimed that he was acting in self-defense against this anarchist medic who was going around, obviously unarmed, and who's going around de-escalating things. And I had all these people that I might identify as liberals say, well, I guess the police believes that he was acting in self-defense. And when I thought about it, I'm like, those people aren't liberals, because liberals care about things like courts and judges and not having police have all of the state power at their disposal. I think those people are just like cowards. But properly, liberals are going to be people that think of the current institutions we have, the current political framework we're working in, and ideology as sufficient for, and the best we can do. So kind of by definition, I think they're not generally ever going to support anything that's going to be illegal, because it's calling into question those institutions, right? The only exceptions we can think of, and this is maybe sort of progressive liberals, the lefty end of them, are things like nonviolent civil disobedience, where they're invoking certain actions that MLK and Gandhi did. But it's notable that those only work because they're appealing for future laws. They're saying that their present laws are bad, but they're suggesting future laws to replace them by breaking the law. That's the only okay kind of illegality I think a real liberal is going to acknowledge. So another thing that I think beyond rioting, all of these kinds of illegal, criminal, political actions that we're seeing, and the appeal of them, the reason why, especially anarchists, but I think even wider appeal, why those are popping up so much now is because the more people think of our current institution as inadequate, the more they're going to be interested in thinking of ways to change the world outside of those, to have political power outside of those. There's a common misconception that people think of, this general public, the people who aren't taking to the streets or whatever, as apathetic or stupid. I don't think that's a problem. I think there's a massive amount of frustration in this country across the board, and I think there's a lot of people who actually are pretty sympathetic to a radical critique of it. They're just hopeless that there's anything that they can do. So the challenge that political movements have is to question people's hopelessness, not convince them of right ideas or to care about stuff. So one of the ways to challenge hopelessness is to show that there's stuff that you can do and get away with that you maybe didn't realize you could do. I mentioned before the neoliberal state really, we're obviously seeing these incredible means of surveillance. It seems like you're potentially being listened to from 5 directions at any point in the day. You could be processed in that center in Utah by some NSA computer, and it's easy to feel controlled at every moment of your life, and that's how it works. It's not possible to control everybody, but it seems possible to actually make everybody feel controlled. And so social movements, when they are breaking the law, when they're doing explicitly public illegal activity, it's to show people that they're not as controlled as they thought they were, and there's room to act. And that, I think, is a very effective way of challenging that feeling of hopelessness.
So that's a part of the spell that's broken, is the limitations that the cops in our heads that we adopt by being socialized into the system as to what are the norms of activity or what muscles we actually have, sort of.
Yeah, I love that. What muscles we actually have. That's a really great way to put it. We're not as hopeless as we thought we were. I'll say, for me, I got involved with stuff, particularly around the first Persian Gulf War in 91, 92. And I was part of blocking Interstate 5, and we shut down a federal building. We did all this stuff in it was organized by a pretty small group of crazy anarchist kids. Everybody's like 22 years old. I was a little younger. And, I've had my ups and downs in my life. I've done a lot of different things. And a lot of times I've tried to convince myself that I didn't have any power. There's no point. I might as well just kind of go along with, maybe like I was going to be like some artsy guy or whatever. I tried to not be political But that thing was always nagging in my head from that experience of disrupting that reproduction of daily life, of disrupting those moments really effectively. I knew that I could be part of shutting down the federal building. I knew that I could be part of blocking that freeway. And when you have that knowledge, you can never really convince yourself that you're powerless again. You can be in pretty dark moments, but there's probably something you can do that you just haven't thought of yet. And that's political. That's like a extremely powerful political change to bring about in somebody.
Yeah. That hope and agency. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly, agency, yeah.
So a few times near the end of the text, you argue that the reification of smashy or property destruction or violent engagement as an end in and of itself is short-sighted and sort of a trap. Like this is something that is used was used in arguments during, for instance, Occupy by Chris Hedges. There was an article by Ryan Harvey, I think, that was "Are We Addicted to Rioting?" There are all these critiques from within the progressive to left to even like anarchist scenes about destruction as an end in and of itself. As taking a position positive to what one might call a social insurrection or insurrectional anarchist perspective, what critique might you raise of the methods and mindset of antisocial insurrectional tendencies like smashy for its own sake?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way the whole book is trying to get at that, although it might not be so obvious. I said back in the beginning that the real split that I see is kind of between people who are thinking strategically as part of the world, as, caring about what's happening to the people around them and wanting to change these horrific patterns and institutions we're surrounded with, versus people who are kind of doing stuff to express themselves and don't really care about the effects of those things. And it's maybe a little too simple because expressing yourself politically and in public is a really important part of being political, right? But it's not enough. It doesn't do the trick on its own. So the most obvious critique in the book is about these nonviolence people, and we haven't talked about it a lot in this interview, but certainly a lot of people attracted to nonviolence, they're doing it as a way to feel okay in the world without really challenging power. I want to be clear about that. The funny thing is, some of the more allegedly radical tenets, such as antisocial nihilists or whatever, people who feel like they're questioning the most, I think they've got the same problem. Let me put it a different way. In the book, I talk about how nonprofits have had this structural effect on the left and social challengers by taking the symbols of resistance from the past, but then, because they have this funding cycle, even if, nonprofits, NGOs can be doing valuable work sometimes that I think is good. In the end, the problem is by having these sort of funding cycles and having to get money from grants, like the Ford Foundation or whatever, that ultimately has kind of conservative interest behind it, it takes the edge off what they do and it discourages actual disruption over time. The funny thing is, I think a lot of people who think of themselves as like the most radical are doing the same thing by limiting their appeal and keeping their groups intentionally small, by fetishizing secrecy and never seeing a reason to kind of have coalitions and work with others. They're making themselves totally non-threatening, which means they're not going to be taking risks. Because the repression comes, we see in history, the repression comes when there's actually a threat to the social order. And a lot of the people in the kind of antisocial tendencies, at least that I see out here in the Northwest and the Bay Area, they're not interested in kind of forcing social change. They're not interested in taking on power. They're interested in expressing their opposition to it. And I think it's kind of like, I think of it as kind of like New Ageism with dyspepsia. It's like, it still comes back to like one's own subjective universe cut off from a life in the world. And essentially it's avoiding confrontation with power, by kind of hiding in abstraction. So I think in our current moment, we really need to be taking seriously the changes that we're seeing. I'm actually reading Trotsky even though I'm not a Trotskyist, right? And Trotsky was talking about the catastrophe that Stalin made, where Stalin was like, you're stupid if you think fascism is a new threat. It's just as bad as capitalism. You're defending the old order if you say there's something wrong with the new order. And that sounds like half the people I know on Facebook. People are like, it's racist for you to say that this current moment is like worse or something. I think we need to take really seriously the changes that we're seeing right now, both with this happening at the state level and happening with grassroots mobilizations, and really rethink the way that we do stuff. Because of that, I think we need to be humble and be ready to meet friends and alliances, even if we have a lot of disagreements on other issues. We need to find common ground with people. And we need to, part of that is we just need to focus on like what you want to do in the world versus like what kind of pure identity you want to be showcasing. It also means, realizing security culture isn't always about more secrecy. Sometimes that can actually make you more vulnerable. Security culture sometimes means being very public and getting support, so that if somebody comes after you, you'll have friends on your side. That can be what keeps you safe. That's how we shot down a grand jury FBI sweep in Seattle a few years ago. Is basically a lot of people we don't agree with thought that it was messed up that the FBI was trying to suppress the movement. So I kind of hope that in the current moment we see more radicals, anarchists think about appealing outside of our circles, about doing a more sort of public-facing thing than we're used to. A lot of counter-hegemonic violence, like I write about in the book, is about making things visible and calling people's values into question. And maybe we're in a moment now where we need to be doing that in a bunch of different ways.
So this is what you're talking about is outside of appeals to the media or whatever, because you also made the statement earlier on that the civil rights movement under MLK, for instance, was, and the early Panthers and the anti-war movements, all this stuff were dealing with the media as it stood, with the American government being very afraid of being shamed in the eyes of the world audience when competing with a certain set of values that were being presented by the Soviet Union. So there's who we address our appeals to or address our opinions and perspectives to by being public. There's individuals that are going to be perceiving and engaging with what we're throwing out there and what we're providing and what words and ideas we're sharing. But it's not the same landscape that past movements have engaged with to try to get public opinion on their side, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not the same landscape that previous movements have had. And I think, especially the people who fetishize, nonviolence, but a lot of people who sort of look towards the past forget that that's always going to be the case. So I think it's complicated with media. I think just like it's smart for us to look at the state not just as one thing, but to look for contradictions inside it. And some parts of the state are manifestations of things, social demands that, movements forced in the past, and then they were codified in the state. And doesn't mean we trust them or whatever, but it doesn't mean we also just toss them away. There's social functions that we want to keep having, whether they're currently part of the state or not. There's things that we want to do. And then there's other things that are purely bad that we want to get rid of. So in the same way that I think we should be looking at state institutions, not just as one big thing, the state, but as a complicated and contradictory system, we want to do the same with the media. So I think I'm very frustrated in the book with, people who pretend like the media landscape hasn't, I'm very frustrated with people who pretend like the media landscape hasn't changed since 1968. It clearly has. We're never going to get the coverage that movements got at that time. But there's other kinds of openings that might be worth taking advantage of. So I'm looking right now, there was a New York Times article on February 2nd, 2017, called, I think it's this one, Anarchists Respond to Trump's Inauguration by Any Means Necessary. It's one of the most sort of sympathetic to anarchism stories I've ever seen, and it makes the real point that nobody really knows what's ahead, but if anarchists are right and we're faced with real fascism, then maybe like America should be more like the anarchists are. It's crazy to read that, but it's a moment where, some journalist in the New York Times realized that this was an interesting thing to write about, and the editor was like, sure, why not? And they did it. And then I think we got a lot of valuable thoughts out there that people would be exposed to. I'm not saying to be naive, and a lot of time we're smeared by stuff, but I think really thinking critically about what the openings are that we could take advantage of, as well as not being naive and expecting it to be like some other time, we got to be doing a lot of that thinking. What that looks like, on a local level, there's local journalists who have certain relationships with their editors, and I end up being, having friendships with them. And if they know a way to push past their editor that they can get a good story out, then I'm going to call them up and talk to them. But I'm going to make sure before I do that, like, I get some promises that, that they're going to observe certain things that are going to keep people safe and that aren't going to make us look ways we don't want to look or whatever. And if they don't do that, then I won't work with them anymore. So I think I'm ambivalent about that. I kind of came up to activism in ACT UP in Philadelphia, really. And ACT UP is a really incredible group to look at because they're both extremely radical. They did the craziest stuff. I write about them a lot in the book. They really pushed through change, but they were also critically working through media and critically working for some sort of social, for like changes of state policies. We're not there. We're at a different moment, but I think the way that ACT UP kind of saw really carefully what they could get away with without ever being naive and trusting anybody, I think is something that we should emulate. So sometimes I think it's really good to be totally cynical of media and you're just not going to get any good coverage about something. And sometimes I think it's important to try to get something out there, but you got to be really strategic about it. So yeah, I think we don't want to give ourselves any easy answers. And I think a lot of people are open to, like we saw in that New York Times article, a lot of people are sort of surprisingly open to some of the stuff we have to say because they realize that what they expected didn't happen. So it's good for us to be up for that when somebody wants to hear what we have to say without being naive and expecting that that's always going to be the case. You don't ever want to compromise, your values. You don't ever want to compromise what you're saying and what you think the world should be like. So I'm definitely not saying to kind of stoop to the level or whatever, but I think we should be in moments like now ready to talk to people who want to hear our ideas because we might need them at some point very soon.
Thank you, Shon, so much for taking this time to chat. I've really enjoyed it. And for listeners out there, you're going to find a very large podcast in your pocket when you check your phone. But a good discussion.
Yeah, no, it was really great talking versus. It was really in depth.